The first time I saw her, she was standing in my barn doorway, like she'd always belonged there. Sunlight spilling around her and dust hanging in the air between us. She didn't wait for an invitation, just walked past me toward the milk cows as if she'd known them her whole life. Her dress was plain and travel-worn sleeves rolled to the elbow, showing strong arms and skin browned by the sun. I had no idea who she was, but I couldn't seem to move my boots from where they'd rooted to the floor. In 17 years, no stranger had crossed that threshold. And in 17 years, I hadn't felt the shift in the air that her presence brought. Before I tell you how that morning unraveled, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had a single moment change the course of your life. My name's Silas Ward. I was born on the edge of the plains where the wind never stops and the grass rolls like the sea. My folks taught me early that a man's worth is measured in his work and his word. We worked our land with what we had, a team of mules' hand tools and a stubborn streak that kept the roof patched through hailstorms and the well full in dry spells. Sunday was for church, whether in a clapboard building or under a cottonwood when the preacher couldn't make it. We gave what we could to neighbors in need, because someday you might be the one needing a hand. For years, that's how I lived, working dawn to dark, mending fences, driving cattle to market, fixing what broke with whatever I could scavenge. Town was 15 miles south, and I went only when supplies ran low. Those who could afford to buy up land were doing it: railroad men in pressed suits, speculators with city talk and money to burn. Folks like me kept to the edges where the soil was thinner, but the sky felt wider. I'd seen men get swallowed whole chasing promises of easy wealth. And I'd learned early that hard work was the only thing you could count on to pay you back. 17 years ago, all that changed. The winter storms came early, heavy as a death shroud over the hills. My wife Margaret was expecting our first child. That night, with the wind howling like the end of the world, I left her side to ride for the doctor. Snow blinded me, ice tore at the horse's flanks, and every mile felt longer than the last. By the time I got back, both of them were gone. I buried them under the old oak behind the barn and turned my back on the world. Since then, the ranch has been mine alone. No visitors, no help, no welcome for either. That morning when Clarabelle Hayes stepped into my barn without knocking, it was like a pebble dropped into a still pond, small at first, but sending ripples farther than I could see. She moved among the stalls as if she'd read the place in a book. I meant to send her away, but instead I stood there listening to the soft sound of her voice as she greeted each cow like she was being introduced. The air smelled of hay leather and something faintly sweet that didn't belong to this ranch. I didn't know yet why she'd come, but I knew from the way her eyes met mine that she wasn't passing through by accident. And just before she spoke, I caught sight of a rider cresting the ridge in the distance, heading straight for my place. The rider's silhouette sharpened as he came down the ridge, dust lifting from his horse's hooves in the afternoon light. I could tell by the set of his shoulders that this wasn't a neighbor out for a visit. Clarabelle glanced from me to the approaching figure, then went back to the cow she was milking, her motions steady and unhurried. I stepped to the barn door, leaning against the post as the horse slowed to a walk in the yard. The man swung down, dusting his hat against his thigh. "Ward," he said, his voice low and even. It was Seth Rollins, 37, a ranch hand I'd known years back when I still came into town regular. He looked older now, leaner, with lines cut deep from sun and wind. "Thought you'd want to know there's talk in town about your spread. Couple of fellows asking questions at the livery. Not the kind of questions you'd take kindly." Clarabelle's head turned slightly, but she didn't speak. I felt the old instinct to shut the door on anything coming from town, but Rollins had never been one for stirring trouble without cause. "What kind of fellows?" I asked. He shifted eyes, flicking toward the barn. "One's dressed like he's from the city, dark coat, shiny boots. Others got the look of a man who's seen more than his share of fights. Folks say they've been asking if this place is for sale if you're looking to move on. My grip tightened on the doorframe. You tell them anything. Rollins shook his head. Told them you don't take kindly to strangers prying into your business. He gave me a nod, mounted up, and rode back toward the trail without another word. When the hoofbeats faded, I turned to find Clarabelle watching me with those steady eyes. Sounds like someone's aiming to unsettle you, she said. Her tone wasn't prying, but there was no mistaking the weight of her curiosity. I didn't answer right away, moving instead to check the feed bins. Men come and go with talk, I said finally. Not worth losing a night's sleep. Still that evening, the air felt different. We finished the milking in silence, the warm smell of the barn mixing with the cool drift of night air through the open doors. Clarabelle carried the last pail toward the house, her skirt catching on a splintered board, and I caught it loose before she moved on. In the lamplight of the kitchen, she set the milk down and leaned against the counter. You've been here a long time, Silas, she said. Long enough to know when trouble's coming. I ladled stew into bowls, the simple act giving me a reason not to meet her gaze. Trouble's like weather. You can see it on the horizon, but it's not always headed your way. She took the bowl sitting at the table. And if it is? She asked. The question hung between us, unanswered. After supper, I stepped out to the porch. The moon was rising over the ridge, pale light washing the pasture. Somewhere beyond that ridge lay the town with its chatter and deals made behind closed doors. Clarabelle joined me, a shawl around her shoulders. Seth seems like a man who measures his words, she said. I nodded. He's not one for idle talk. She studied the horizon, then turned toward me. If there's something coming, I'd rather know than be caught by surprise. I looked at her, the lamplight from the window tracing the edge of her profile. Some things are better faced alone, I said. She didn't flinch. And some things aren't meant to be faced alone at all. Her words stayed with me after she went inside. The next morning broke clear and cool. I was in the barn early, the sound of hooves on packed earth carrying from the pasture. Clarabelle arrived a little later, hair pulled back ready for the day's work. We moved through the chores with practiced rhythm, but my mind kept circling back to Rollins's warning. By midday, a thin line of dust showed on the southern trail. I set down the pail I was carrying and walked to the gate. 2 riders this time, just as Rollins had described, one with the pressed coat, the other with a worn hat pulled low. They didn't hurry, but there was purpose in their approach. Clarabelle came to stand beside me. Are those the men? She asked quietly. I nodded once. Best head inside. She stayed where she was. The riders pulled up a few yards from the fence. The man in the dark coat tipped his hat. Mr. Ward, he said, voice smooth as if we were meeting at a church social. Name's Albert Granger. My associate here is Cole Vance. We've been traveling the territory looking for certain parcels of interest. I rested my arms on the top rail, meeting his gaze without invitation. This one's not for sale. Granger smiled slow and practiced. Everything's for sale, Mr. Ward. Just a matter of price. His partner scanned the pasture, the barn, the house. Fine piece of land, Vance said. Shame to see it go underused. Clarabelle shifted beside me, but I didn't take my eyes off the men. You've had your look, I said. Trail's back that way. Granger's smile thinned. Think it over. We'll be in town for a few days. With that, they turned their horses and rode off, leaving a trail of dust curling behind them. When they were gone, Clarabelle let out a slow breath. They're not just looking to buy, she said. I nodded. No. And men like that don't walk away easy. We finished the day's work without much talk, but the sense of something closing in hung heavy in the air. That evening, as I brought in wood for the stove, I saw a slip of paper nailed to the gatepost. The paper fluttered in the wind, a single line written in a sharp, careful hand. "We'll have an answer before the week's out." I stood there a long while, the chill creeping in from the open ground beyond. Inside, Clarabelle moved about the kitchen, the smell of bread rising in the warm air. I pulled the note free and folded it into my pocket. Whatever answer they were waiting on, it would not be the one they expected. The note stayed in my pocket for most of the day, the paper growing soft at the folds as I went about the work. Clarabelle didn't mention it, though. I caught her glance at my coat more than once. We stacked feed in the barn, patched a loose board on the corral, and drove a stubborn heifer back in from the north pasture. The sky hung low with gray clouds, wind smelling of rain. By late afternoon, I saddled the bay and rode the fence line. The stillness of the far ridge had always been a comfort, but that day it felt like the quiet before a door is opened. On the south boundary, I found a section of wire clipped clean and pulled back, no sign of the tools left behind, just fresh boot prints in the soft dirt. They weren't mine or Clarabelle's. I knelt, pressing my hand into the print. The heel was narrow, likely a city-made boot. 2 sets, one heavier than the other. They'd come from the direction of the wagon road and turned back the same way. The cattle were accounted for, but this wasn't about livestock. This was a message. When I got back, Clarabelle was at the well drawing water. She looked up as I unsaddled. "Find anything?" she asked. I set the saddle on the rail. "South fence has been cut." Her hands paused on the bucket rope. "Could have been drifters?" I shook my head. "Boot tracks same size as those men in town." She carried the bucket toward the house, her steps quick, the water sloshing. Then they're pushing for an answer. I followed her inside. The lamplight caught the edge in her expression as she set the bucket down. "You going to town?" I took off my hat, hanging it on the peg. "Not yet. No point stepping into their ground when they've already set foot on mine." That night I checked the door locks and laid the rifle within easy reach of the table. Rain came in a steady whisper, tapping against the windows, sliding from the eaves. Clarabelle moved quietly around the kitchen, setting bread to rise for morning. Neither of us said much, but the unspoken weight in the room was heavier than the storm. By morning the sky had cleared. I rode into town with the wagon, a list of supplies written in my hand. The main street was quiet except for a few wagons hitched along the boardwalk. I tied off at the Mercantile and stepped inside. Mr. Rourke, the shopkeeper, glanced up from the counter. "Morning, Ward. Heard you had company yesterday." His tone was casual, but his eyes were watchful. I set the list down. 2 men passing through. He measured out flour into a paper sack. "They've been asking around about land records. Even went over to see the county clerk. Didn't sound like they were looking to make friends." From the Mercantile, I went to the smithy. My mare's front shoe had loosened, and I figured I'd have her shod before heading home. While the smith worked, I caught sight of Granger and Vance across the street talking with a man I didn't know, a thick-set fellow with a scar along his jaw. They looked my way, and Granger smiled as if we were old acquaintances. I turned back to the Anvil's Ring. On the ride home, I took the long route circling the ridge from the west. The ground was softer there from the rain, and I found fresh tracks leading toward my land from the county road, 3 horses this time. They hadn't gone past the fence, but they'd come close enough to see the house. Clarabelle met me at the gate when I returned. "They were here," she said, voice low. "I saw them from the upstairs window. They didn't come in, just stopped on the rise and looked for a while. I led the mare to the barn. They're testing the edges." She followed me inside, and if they decide to step over, I pulled the saddle off, setting it down slow. Then we see how far they're willing to push. The rest of the day passed with the usual chores, but every sound beyond the fence had me listening. By evening, clouds were piling again in the west. Clarabelle was in the yard gathering in the wash when we both heard hoofbeats coming up the trail fast. I stepped to the porch as a rider came into view, coat dark with sweat and dust. It was Seth Rollins. He swung down before the horse stopped moving. "They've filed a claim in town," he said without preamble. "Went to the clerk this morning with papers saying you'd agreed to sell, got a signature and everything." My jaw tightened. "They forged it," Seth nodded. "Looks enough like your hand to pass with someone who don't know better. Clerk's giving them 3 days to prove it out before the judge." Clarabelle came up beside me, her face pale in the fading light. "What happens if the judge believes them?" Seth looked at her, then back to me. "They'll put the deed in their name, and you'll be left to fight it in court on their terms, not yours." The wind picked up, rattling the dry leaves along the fence. I looked past Seth toward the ridge, the trail running down into the dark. 3 days wasn't long, but it would be enough to decide whose ground this was going to be. Seth stayed only long enough to water his horse before heading back toward town. Clarabelle and I watched him ride out the dust from his trail, curling into the cooling air. The sun was low, painting the ridge in long shadows. But I knew we'd be up late talking through what came next. Inside, she moved quietly around the kitchen, setting the table for supper while I stoked the stove. 3 days, she said finally, not looking at me. That's all they need, to take everything you've kept standing. I ladled stew into bowls, the smell of onions and salt pork filling the room. They still have to prove that paper, I answered. And they can't do it if we stay ahead of them. We ate without much talk. Every so often I caught her glancing toward the window as if she half expected those riders to come back tonight. When the dishes were done, I stepped out to the porch. The moon was a pale cut above the ridge, and the wind carried the smell of distant rain. Clarabelle joined me, her shawl tight across her shoulders. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. I kept my eyes on the trail. "Tomorrow I ride to town. I'll see the clerk myself, and I'll put it to him plain that the signature's a forgery. If that's not enough, I'll take it to the judge before they do." She stood beside me in silence for a moment. "Then you're not planning to wait for them to make the next move?" I shook my head. "Waiting's how you get caught standing still." At first light, I saddled the bay. Clarabelle handed me a wrapped loaf of bread and a small tin of coffee. "Don't let them pin you in a corner," she said. I gave her a nod, mounted, and headed down the trail. The ride was quiet except for the creak of the saddle leather and the steady rhythm of hooves on hard-packed earth. Town was already waking when I arrived. The smith's fire was going, and a wagon loaded with feed sacks rattled past the mercantile. I tied off outside the clerk's office. Inside, the air smelled of ink and paper. Thomas Kilburn, the county clerk, looked up from a ledger. "Ward," he said, "I heard you might be stopping in." I stepped to the counter. "I want to see the claim filed against my property." He opened a drawer and pulled out a folded document, sliding it across to me. My name was there in ink that looked close enough to my hand to fool someone who didn't know better. The signature date was 2 weeks past. "That's not mine," I said. Kilburn scratched the side of his jaw. "It favors your writing close enough. Judge Merrick will want more than your word, Silas." His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the weight of someone used to seeing bad paper made to look good. "You've got until Friday to bring proof." From the clerk's, I went to the telegraph office. The operator, a young man named Henry Abbott, took my note for the bank in Abilene, asking for a copy of my deed and the date it was recorded. If the reply came in time, it might be enough to put a stop to things before they reached the judge. As I stepped out onto the boardwalk, Granger and Vance were there leaning against the hitch rail. Granger tipped his hat. "Morning, Ward. Hear you've been busy." I met his gaze. "You've got nerve walking these streets after what you filed." He smiled like it was all a misunderstanding. "Just business. Nothing personal." Vance stepped forward, his shadow falling across the planks. You could make this easier on yourself. Take what we're offering, walk away. I looked from one to the other. You'll get your answer soon enough. Pushing past them, I untied my horse and rode out without looking back. By the time I reached the ridge again, the sky was heavy with clouds. Clarabelle was waiting by the gate. "Well?" she asked. I dismounted. "They've got the paper. We've got until Friday." She took the reins from me. "And if the bank's answer doesn't come?" I glanced toward the house, already thinking through the next step. "Then we'll have to find another way to prove the truth." That night, I laid the rifle on the table and trimmed the lamp low. Clarabelle moved about the kitchen, her hands steady as she set bread and cold meat on a plate between us. "They'll come again," she said. I nodded. "And we'll be ready when they do." Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called. The sound echoed off the ridge, fading into the wind. I couldn't see the trail from the porch, but I had the feeling it wouldn't stay empty for long. The wind had a restless edge the next morning, rattling the dry grass along the ridge. Clarabelle stood at the gate with me as I checked the cinch on the bay. "If that wire's cut again, I want to see it myself," she said. I didn't argue, though. Part of me wanted to keep her clear of whatever was coming. We rode the south boundary slow, scanning the fence line. Half a mile out, we found what I expected, a fresh splice where someone had cut through and twisted the wire back in place. The work was hurried, the kind meant to hide tracks, but not from anyone who knew the land. I dismounted, crouching to study the ground. "2 sets of prints," I said. Clarabelle leaned from her saddle, eyes narrowing. "Same boots," I nodded. "And same direction they headed toward the creek bed." We followed the tracks until the ground turned to gravel, where sign disappears quick. From there, we circled back toward the house. Midday found us in the barn, oiling tack. Clarabelle set down the rag she was using. "We can't just keep finding where they've been. We need to catch them at it." I tightened the bridle straps. "That's likely what they want, push us to meet them on their terms." She crossed her arms. "And if their terms are to take what's yours while we watch?" Her words sat heavy between us. After a while, I said, "We'll change the pattern tonight. I'll make the ride into town after dark, see if Kilburn's had word from the bank. You keep the lamps low and doors bolted." She gave a short nod, though I could tell she didn't like the plan. Dusk came early, with the clouds stacking in the west. I saddled the mare and rode the back trail toward town. The air smelled of rain, and by the time I reached the outskirts, the lamps were lit in the windows. The clerk's office was dark, but the telegraph office still showed light. Henry Abbott was inside, had bent over the key. He looked up when I stepped in. "Got an answer for you," he said, sliding a folded slip across the counter. The message from Abilene was short. The bank confirmed my deed was recorded proper. No sale, no transfer. It was the paper I needed, though. Getting it before the judge in time was the next hurdle. I stepped back into the street, the rain starting to fall in light drops. Across the way, Granger and Vance stood under the mercantile awning, talking to the scar-jawed man I'd seen before. They watched me mount up, but didn't move to follow. By the time I reached the ridge, the rain had picked up. The house was dark except for a thin line of light from the kitchen. Clarabelle opened the door before I knocked. "Well?" she asked. I held out the telegraph slip. She read it quick, then looked up. "That's proof, isn't it?" I nodded. Enough to make the judge think twice. We ate by lamplight, the sound of rain on the roof. Halfway through the meal, the horses in the corral snorted and shifted. Clarabelle set down her fork. "That's not the wind." I moved to the window, lifting the curtain just enough to see. 3 figures on horseback sat beyond the gate rain, running off their coats. They didn't come forward, just waited there in the dark, the light from the house catching the shine of water on their hats. One of them raised a hand in a slow wave before turning his horse and riding back toward the trail. The others followed. Clarabelle came to stand beside me. "They know you've got something," she said quietly. I let the curtain fall back. "Then they'll push harder before Friday." We cleared the table, neither of us saying much. Later, I checked the rifle and set it within reach. The rain eased before midnight, but the air still felt charged, like the storm wasn't done. Out on the ridge, a coyote gave a short, sharp call before silence settled again. By morning, the rain had passed, leaving the ground slick and the air sharp with the smell of wet cedar. Clarabelle was already in the yard, gathering wood from the pile. "If you're heading to town, you should do it before the road dries," she said. I agreed, but first I walked the fence east of the house. No new cuts, only the tracks from yesterday's patrol softened by the rain. We rode together as far as the fork in the trail. She kept her eyes on the hills as we talked through what to say if Granger or Vance tried to block my way to the judge. At the fork, she turned back toward the ranch, and I pushed on toward town. The streets were busier than usual for midweek. 2 freight wagons stood outside the mercantile, and I caught sight of the sheriff, Eli Crawford, leaning against the post in front of his office. He nodded when I passed, but didn't stop me. The clerk's office was my first stop. Kilburn was inside, bent over a ledger. He looked up, then set his pen aside. "That bank paper came through," he said. "You've got your deed clear as the day it was signed." I took the folded document from him, checking the seal. "This is enough to stand before Judge Merrick." Kilburn hesitated. "It should be, but Merrick will want to hear both sides. You'd better be ready for them to throw something else at you." His words sat with me as I left. The judge's chambers were above the feed store. The stair treads groaned under my boots as I climbed. Merrick was a heavy-set man in his 50s, spectacles perched low on his nose. He took the paper from me, scanning it slowly. "This is strong evidence, Mr. Ward," he said. "But I can't rule before the hearing. Friday morning, both parties present." On the way back to my horse, I saw Vance leaning against the rail in front of the saloon. Granger wasn't with him. "Word is you've been busy," Vance said, watching me with a flat stare. "Maybe enough to make this more difficult for you." I stepped down into the street between us. "You've already made it difficult. The rest is just noise." I didn't wait for him to answer. The ride home felt longer than it should have. The clouds had begun to build again, low and dark over the ridge. When I reached the gate, Clarabelle came out to meet me. "You saw the judge?" she asked. I handed her the folded deed. "He'll hear us Friday." She opened the paper, eyes scanning the lines. "Then we've got 2 days to keep them from finding another way to turn this." I could hear the determination in her voice. "And we use them," I said. "We watch the land, we stay ready." That evening, we checked the outbuildings, making sure every latch and lock was secure. Clarabelle fed the stock while I split enough wood to last through the week. By the time the last light faded from the sky, the lamps were lit, and the rifle lay across the table. We were finishing supper when the sound of hoofbeats came slow and deliberate, stopping just beyond the yard. Clarabelle's hand stilled on her fork. I moved to the window. A single rider sat there, hat pulled low, raincoat dripping. He didn't dismount, just waited. After a long moment, he turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. No wave, no call, just the quiet thud of hooves fading into the dark. Clarabelle joined me at the window. "They're measuring us," she said. I nodded, "and they'll find out soon enough where we stand." The day before the hearing broke clear and cold, the kind of morning where sound carries far across the ridge. Clarabelle was in the yard feeding the chickens when I came back from the east pasture. "No sign of them?" she asked. I shook my head. "Not yet." But we both knew that didn't mean they weren't close. We spent the morning making sure the papers from the bank were packed and ready. Clarabelle wrapped the deed in oilskin and tied it with cord. "If you have to put this in the judge's hand, it needs to be clean and dry," she said. I tucked it into my coat pocket, the weight of it more than just paper. By midday, I saddled the bay and rode into town to see Sheriff Crawford. He was on the porch of his office mending a bridle strap. "Heard tomorrow's going to be a busy day," he said without looking up. I told him about the cut fences, the riders in the dark, and the forged claim. He listened, then set the strap aside. "I can't take sides before the judge hears it, Ward. But I can keep an eye on the edges." From there, I went to the Mercantile for lamp oil and coffee. As I stepped out, Granger was across the street speaking to a man I didn't recognize, thin, sharp-faced, and dressed in a coat too fine for the dust of this town. The two of them looked my way, and Granger tipped his hat with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I took the long trail home, watching my back trail until the ridge hid me from view. Clarabelle was on the porch when I rode in the evening light, catching in her hair. "You were gone longer than I thought," she said. Had a stop to make, I answered. I didn't tell her about the stranger. There was no need to give her another worry before tomorrow. We spent the rest of the evening in quiet work, mending a strap on the pack saddle, oiling the rifle stock, setting out clothes that wouldn't draw the judge's eye for the wrong reasons. The smell of bread baking filled the kitchen. Clarabelle moved with purpose, her face calm, but her eyes steady on the tasks at hand. After supper, we sat at the table with the lamp turned low. "You'll ride in early?" she asked. I nodded. "Before first light. Want to be there when the judge opens his door." She folded her hands on the table. "Then I'll see to the stock and keep the doors locked. If anyone comes asking, they'll get no answer from me." The wind rose as night came on, carrying the sound of a lone horse moving slow along the trail. We both heard it. I stepped to the window, the lamplight throwing my shadow across the wall. A rider came into view, stopping just short of the gate. Even in the dark, I could make out Vance's frame. He sat there for a moment, then turned his horse without a word and rode back into the night. Clarabelle joined me at the window. "They're letting you know they'll be there," she said. I let the curtain fall back. "Then they'll see me waiting for them." The morning of the hearing came cold and still, with frost whitening the grass along the fence. I saddled the bay. Before first light, the oilskin-wrapped deed tucked safe inside my coat. Clarabelle stood at the porch, her shawl pulled close. "I'll be here when you ride back," she said. I gave her a nod and turned toward the trail. Town was already stirring when I arrived. Folks gathered outside the feed store and along the boardwalk drawn by the promise of a courtroom dispute. Judge Merrick's chambers were warm from the stove, the air smelling of paper and coal smoke. Granger and Vance were already seated at the long table, their hats on the bench beside them. Merrick looked over the room, then called us to order. Granger spoke first, laying out their claim with the smooth confidence of a man who'd rehearsed every line. He placed the forged document before the judge as if it were solid truth. When it was my turn, I stood and set the bank's deed beside it. The seal caught the light, and Merrick studied it for a long moment before asking Kilburn to confirm the record. The clerk's voice was steady. "This deed is the only one recorded for the Ward property. No sale, no transfer." A murmur rippled through the room. Merrick leaned back in his chair. "Then the claim filed by Mr. Granger and Mr. Vance is without standing. This court recognizes Silas Ward as the rightful owner." Granger's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Vance shifted in his seat, eyes dark. The gavel came down with a single sharp rap, and it was over. I gathered my papers and walked out into the pale sunlight. The sheriff stood nearby, watching the two men mount up and ride out without looking back. The ride home felt different, the air lighter somehow. When I reached the ridge, Clarabelle was waiting at the gate. She smiled when she saw me, and I could feel the weight of the last weeks slipping away. We put the horses up and walked to the porch together. That evening, the lamps burned warm in the windows, and the wind carried only the scent of wood smoke. We ate in easy silence, the kind that comes when there's nothing left to guard against. Later, as I stepped outside, the land stretched quiet and unbroken under the stars. Looking out over the pasture, I knew the fight had been about more than a deed. It was about standing your ground when others would rather see you move on, about keeping hold of the place where your roots run deep. And sometimes it's about letting someone stand beside you, so the burden isn't yours alone. If you've ever held on to something worth defending, you know the kind of strength it takes. I'd like to hear about those moments. Share them if you can, and don't forget to stay a while for the next story.